when I learned that the US, despite kind of being the richest country in the history of the world, had kind of by far the highest poverty rate in the developed world, I was shocked. In California, let's say there's only about one legal aid attorney for every 50,000 residents. As a result, about 2/3 of people who have a legal problem and affirmatively try to get help will be turned away. A woman who grew up in Bayview and married her high school sweetheart and trapped in this abusive relationship. Each legal aid attorney has about 8 times more influence in reducing property crime than each police officer does.
We believe that the next wave of innovation is innovation in the area of social impact.
We want to try to bring awareness about the incarcerated.
A huge number of people are currently homeless simply because they could not get legal help.
A safe place where they can get set free.
There's no hack for human connection.
Codependency is an addiction.
Do not try to do this big thing at once. Start with a little.
When you're searching for the gold, you will get back so much more than you ever thought possible.
So what do you think? The ball's in your court.
Hi, I'm Ted Hahs, and I am the host of Innovate, Let's Solve the World's Biggest Challenges. This is the Innovate podcast. Our goal is to explore innovation in the area of social impact. So today, my guest is my dear friend, Adrian Tirtanadi, who founded Open Door Legal. So Adrian, introduce yourself and tell us about your organization.
Well, it's great to be here, Ted. I'm looking forward to innovating with you. My name is Adrian Tirtanadi. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Open Door Legal. And we are working on pioneering the country's first system of universal access to civil legal representation right here in San Francisco.
How did you get here? Tell me a little bit about your backstory.
Well, when I was a kid, sort of had this kind of high curiosity. And when I learned that the US, despite kind of being the richest country in the history of the world, had kind of by far the highest poverty rate in the developed world, I was shocked. And I remember being in middle school and really being quite upset about this. When I went to college, I kind of studied poverty from a sort of number of angles, including like political economy and sociology. And then I went to work in community development for a few years. And eventually I had this thesis that the sort of biggest contributor to poverty in America was our sort of collective failure to provide access to civil representation.
Wow. So when did you have this epiphany?
Somewhere between the end of college and 3 years after college.
What'd you do next?
I went to work, as I said, in the field for a few years, had this inspiration, which I think came from God, and wrote out a business plan about how I thought how I would kind of achieve universal access to legal help, and then took that business plan, applied to law school, went to law school, and then started the org 2 weeks after I got my license.
Tell us more about what this looks like.
In the United States or in California, let's say there's only about one legal aid attorney for every 50,000 residents. And as a result, about 2/3 of people who have a legal problem and affirmatively try to get help will be turned away and be unable to get any help. And in every other developed country, you're guaranteed representation in all civil matters. And these can include evictions, domestic violence, immigration, and consumer fraud. And so the goal is really to ensure everybody who's trying to reach out and get legal help and has a kind of issue that can be addressed will be able to get help. So what it looks like in practice is, we have a team of about 47 staff and about half our attorneys, and we represent low-income residents in over 35 areas of law. So it's kind of like a public defender, but for the civil issues in the community.
Give us some case studies. What do the people look like who you're serving?
A woman who grew up in Bayview and married her high school sweetheart and trapped in this abusive relationship. And she was assaulted about twice every week for 8 years. And despite, the police being called at one point and being hospitalized at one point, the abuse never ended, right? And one day her husband calls the cops and says, "Oh, my wife has hit me," which wasn't true, but they come, they arrest her. She spends 5 nights in jail. This is actually a pretty common tactic for abusers to use the police in this way. It's kind of a method of control to kind of reestablish dominance, because when she was released, she was given this restraining order and it prevented her from going home. And so she couldn't get any money. She couldn't see her children. She couldn't even get a change of clothes. And so she ended up homeless in San Francisco. And she went to, in her words, in her telling, 10 different agencies around the city and asked for help. And they all turned her away because of what I mentioned earlier. And finally, she found Open Door Legal, and we did a 3-day trial. And we got her back in the home. And then there was, the child custody issue, child support issue, and the divorce. So that took like an additional several months. But it was all successful. And from that moment on, she was never hit again. She remained housed. She re-entered the workforce. It's, I think, quite the indictment of our society that, we have child protective services, we have medical services, we have shelters. But literally the one thing she needed, the most cost-effective solution, was the one she couldn't get, the one that we don't provide as a society, right? And that's access to justice.
Right now, okay, I care about housing, or I care about addiction, or I care about human trafficking, or I care about prison reform, criminal justice reform. But in reality, all of these are totally interconnected.
Yeah.
And if we're allocating our funds to categories, the system of care is going to be fragmented, or we're helping it be. It's already deeply fragmented, and it's been proven across the board over and over that a fragmented system sucks.
Yeah.
And a coordinated system works really good. We've got to frame the way that we look at it and see that there's one core issue, what'd you call that? A system of value, a value matrix that really, it's not about the house, it's not about the addiction, it's about the person, and it's helping them be restored, their relationships be restored, and it's really about human flourishing.
Yeah, and human flourishing, there's so many different blockers to human flourishing, right? And they affect they work at different scales for different populations. So, just because something is working really well, if you scale it up to a certain size, you're going to see diminishing returns, and then at the meantime, there might be another thing that is super effective, but you're not even considering because you've already defined the categories you're interested in.
So share with me more about those data. I had heard you share a study that showed that every dollar invested in legal aid saves $4 in law enforcement.
Basically, property crime is very sensitive to poverty, right? So when people have not a lot of money, they're more likely to engage in property crime, or they're unemployed or something. So when you give people access to legal help, this dramatically reduces expropriation, which means people have more money and therefore engage in less property crime. And that this effect is actually really high. So one data science team we worked with said that each legal aid attorney has about 8 times more influence in reducing property crime than each police officer does.
Your intervention resulted in a 50%-ish, within a margin of error, a half drop in homelessness. We know how much homelessness costs society.
Yeah.
Homelessness costs society, is it $80,000 a year per person homeless? No, it's $60,000 nationwide. It's probably double that in the Bay Area.
We can also do studies like that, but I really like making sure there's a clear feedback loop between the beneficiary's experience and the funding, right?
if you don't happen to be in a place where Open Door Legal can help you, which is what right now 2/3 of San Francisco.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're in someplace else. What's the current system in California if you are a victim of wage theft and you're poor?
Basically, you would go to a labor commissioner. So in San Francisco, so it's called the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement. And this is sort of an administrative law agency. So you would kind of file a complaint. And
but if you're poor, how do you even find out that that's what you need?
Well, if you went somewhere, they would refer you to this, and it's all like self-service. So you file a complaint. You generally wait up to 2 years for your hearing, and then once you have the hearing and win, they don't really help with enforcement. So one study found that only about 20% of workers who won their hearing collected any money at all. And basically, if you're a representative, you wouldn't even use this system. You would go straight to Superior Court. Or negotiate directly with the employer.
So I understand you guys just published a white paper showing the link between legal aid intervention and homelessness, which most people don't think about that. When we think of homelessness, we would think of it as an entirely different issue than criminal justice or legal aid or anything.
Yeah. So the study was done by sort of two academics or two PhD economists. And it's a rigorous treatment control study that looked at our work and basically found that we caused homelessness to drop by around half in the Bayview neighborhood of San Francisco, which is the first neighborhood we started in. And what it shows is that if you can prevent all of this expropriation I mentioned, you can dramatically reduce homelessness for a fraction of what the current interventions are. And then the implication is that actually a huge number of people are currently homeless simply because they could not get legal help.
Your model is basically you plant yourself in a neighborhood.
Yeah.
And then you draw a circle around this. Yeah. Everyone who's within a certain neighborhood and makes less than X, right?
Right.
You'll serve for free.
Yeah. So the idea, and this is really the first time this was tried in the US, was to kind of have a small service area, small catchment area, and then totally saturate the need for legal help in that area among income qualified people. And so we pioneered that model in Bayview, and as we've just talked about, this led to homelessness declining by half. And we're currently studying sort of other social effects this has had. But I think it's sort of obvious that from our own internal data that we've also dramatically reduced poverty. We estimate probably $500 million in sort of either current or future assets being created.
I think there's lots and lots of future donors who are really fed up with the situation and they want better options.
Mm-hmm.
And
because usually the big opportunities in philanthropy, it's not like, it's actually more like problem framing, where you're kind of identifying, a need that nobody thought of before, or like a whole new program category rather than, let's find the best housing nonprofit,
You're an innovator. It's tough. They say the first person to cross the wall gets the bloodiest. So talk about some of the challenges you've had to overcome getting to this point.
One way I think innovation works in social impact, or probably the big way, is through something called problem framing, right? Whereas, people see a problem, let's say homelessness, and they don't spend enough time thinking about what is the real problem, and they jump immediately into solutions, right? So they see homelessness and they say, okay, we need to get people housed, right? Rather than start thinking about, well, why are people becoming homeless in the first place, and testing that rigorously. And if you do that, you might say, oh, actually people are becoming unhoused because they can't get legal help, and that therefore, if we provide that, there are a few people that will need to be housed. And that you can see this kind of problem framing through a lot of sort of innovation in social services, right? But the problem is, right, when you're the first person to try and state this, you're cutting against the grain, right? Of what policymakers and academics and existing nonprofits kind of are all saying, right? So it can be very difficult to kind of get people to believe you.
So you're right that if we are going to see innovation in social services, the key is disrupting, reforming, improving the capital market for nonprofits.
And even venture philanthropy gets this wrong because, again, it's not just having metrics, you need comparable metrics. So, for example, in the for-profit world, if you have a business, there's an easy way to compare, business success, which is their profitability ratio, right? So, if you have a business that is earning 5 times as much profit as a business in another sector, it's easy to see, oh, this is a good investment, and people will then invest in that business and in more probably that sector as a whole, right? Because they'll say there's a big investment opportunity.
So you could theoretically now compare them by efficiency. Like one of the metrics is how much money are you spend on services versus administration, fundraising, and others. Well, although even that is very shallow, easy to manipulate.
Yeah, easy to manipulate. And, it doesn't, even if you have a very low overhead ratio, what if your programs suck, right?
Yeah. In the Bay Area, we have a startup culture. Mm-hmm. So, everyone talks about disruption, but we haven't put that same ecosystem, that same focus into the social services area. And I think now there's a huge opportunity if we can do it.
I mean, there's a big opportunity. It's very hard to disrupt in social services because essentially the capital market is very risk averse, and you can't just show up with a new idea as a new org and expect the government to fund you or philanthropy to fund you, right? It can be very, very daunting. We had to really bootstrap it in the beginning. Our first year, we only had a budget of $35,000, right? Our first supporters were essentially all religious congregations, local churches. And then we were eventually able to get to a scale where, the city became interested in helping to support the work. So, we've been trying to work with the city to scale up what we're doing. There's a lot of kind of, let's say, thought leadership that needs to go in to kind of help reframe people, on what the problem really is.
So even if your programs are great, these programs are great, and these programs are great.
Right.
Is that intervention? Is that
whole category?
Yeah, is that whole category? Right. You might be doing that really well, but that doesn't really, how does that relate to making society better?
You have to construct a theory of value, right? How do you value a private for-profit company? There's sort of like an established methodology, right? Okay. I mean, it's open to some interpretation, but there's kind of a method that you would, like an investor would use to say, oh, this company is worth this amount, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of need to construct a similar methodology for nonprofits. What makes a nonprofit is essentially your consumer, right, who's receiving the service can't pay for it. And so there's no price inputs to tell you how valuable it is to them, right? So the best substitute for price is essentially benchmarked qualitative feedback.
What's the next steps for you?
We are hoping to finish scaling citywide, make San Francisco the first city in the country with universal access to civil legal representation, dramatically reduce homelessness, dramatically reduce poverty in San Francisco, really make San Francisco a demonstration of what a society can look like when everyone has access to justice, and from there replicate this across the country.
If we can start coming together and collaborating together, truly exchanging ideas, challenging each other, but in a way that is creating innovative new ideas, and then create more of a data-based approach, evidence-based approach to how we allocate our public resources, I believe we can have far better outcomes and actually solve these problems that would otherwise, we haven't been able to solve yet. So, what's next for you? And how can people find you?
Well, we're on opendoorlegal.org. And as I mentioned, our next step is to finish scaling citywide. We're trying to raise our budget by $4 million per year. And we believe that if we can get that $4 million additional funding per year, we will cut homelessness by 20% citywide within 2 years and 40% within 4 years.
So it's opendoorlegal.org.
Mm-hmm.
And Adrian, people can reach out to you. And thank you for your attention, and thank you for listening and watching Innovate. Let's solve the world's biggest challenges.
Thank you.